Hello everybody, how are you doing? Greetings from Margate. Slightly optimistic here that the sun might be coming out, which is a really good thing to see in the UK. So I've just been here doing a talk and some archive work on Margate Pride, and it's been so amazing to catch up with old friends and share some wonderful memories. And I think that's really important. You know, you've got to go in and touch base with people every now and then and see how they're doing. And yeah, so anyway, this week's blog that I'm getting to is actually a really important part of my research. And it's quite complicated to get into the weeds. So I spent quite some time trying to just simplify it down into, I think it was about 500, 600 words or whatever. But just to really get across the crux of what I'm doing here and what my approach to research means to research culture or research information in general. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. So, empirical or intuitive modes of inquiry, interpreting information in a state of partial revelation. In my 2025 thesis, I make what initially sounds like a scandalous claim. All research, no matter how diligent, arrives at a moment of conjecture. That's not an attack on science. It's not a flirtation with relativism. It's an observation about what actually happens when we try to know something. You can observe, measure, dissect, test and evaluate until you disappear into subatomic weirdness. You can triangulate sources, run regressions, peer review the life out of a paragraph, but eventually you have to conclude. That conclusion, however sophisticated, is an educated guess. A very good guess, perhaps. A reasonable guess, but a guess nonetheless. This is not a weakness in research. It's a structural feature of inquiry in a world that only ever reveals itself partially. I'm going to interject there. So what I'm trying to say is, whenever you're researching anything, there's only so far you can go before you have to kind of guess at the bigger picture or the conclusion that you're making. And a lot of empirical research, even, in fact, most research, I argue all research, but that does run into areas. That's not to say that we don't know anything. Anyway, as I get into it later on. But I think it's really important to hold that picture, right? Because we imbue sometimes our research institutions with this kind of authority over knowledge. And in some cases, that's not to debase what they're doing, but a lot of the time, they're just making educated guesses. And I think once we understand that, that's not to just run away from that and say, oh my God, we don't know anything. No. What I'm saying is, we should just hold that head in when we're listening to the so-called experts about things, to go, okay, well, that's a really good point. Is there anything else we need to know about this? I think that's how it should work. From my experience, it doesn't always work that. Anyway, in developing what I call a mesotopian mode of meaning making, I found myself drawn to the speculative strategies of fiction, particularly the utopian genre. World building works by extrapolation. An author takes fragments of reality and extends them into coherent possibility. The reader recognises the plausibility, not because every detail is empirically verified, but because the world hangs together. It resonates. Research works in much the same way. We gather fragments of the real, data points, interviews, archival traces, phenomenological encounters, and then we construct a model that accounts for them. We're not inventing from nothing, we're extrapolating from partial revelation. Mesotopian logic simply makes this explicit. So quite a few big terms in there that I want to possibly unpack. So as I'm coming from a kind of comparative literature background, and I was looking at how utopian and dystopian world building or fiction works, right? I recognized that many of those strategies that authors or artists use when they're doing this, right, actually resonate with or look like what a lot of academic researchers, including rational material scientists, etc., what they're doing when they're looking at reality and researching something, right? Because they take the fragments of the real they can know, and then they kind of intuitively guess how this all hangs together, right? And so what I'm saying with mesotopian logic is actually we kind of do that all the time when we're in the moment, when we're in our body and our mind and we meet the environment and we're trying to make sense of the environment in which we find ourselves. We take all of that information from what we know, right? What we can touch, what we can smell, what we can hear through the senses. And then we kind of intuitively kind of fill in the gaps, all right? We make sense of it from what we do know, and we kind of structure it around, allowing for the possibility that there's a lot we don't know, all right? Rather than pretending to empirical omniscience, it acknowledges the intuitive component in interpretation. It admits that at some point the researcher must lean into a felt coherence, a sense that the pattern is right, that the explanation fits. Now, the immediate objection is obvious. Doesn't this throw everything into doubt? No, because there is a real world. I am not arguing that reality is optional or that truth is whatever we desire. The world resists us. It surprises us. It refuses to conform to our expectations. Much of it remains withdrawn, opaque, inaccessible, but not imaginary. What we have access to are encounters. These are moments in which something shows up, a document that shifts your understanding, a conversation that reframes the field, a material object that refuses the narrative you were about to impose on it. These phenomenological encounters inform epistemological comprehension. In other words, how things appear to us shapes what we can responsibly claim to know. And I'll just interject there because there's quite a lot going on. So what I'm saying is we have to accept really deep down that we're never going to know everything about everything, right? Which is where I push back on a lot of the materialists and the scientific materialists who say everything can be known if we kind of follow this method. What I'm saying is there are always going to be certain things that elude our comprehension. But if we acknowledge that, if we say, okay, I'm making this particular assumption about this, and we kind of know that this is going to happen because we've observed it again and again and again, but we still accept that there could be an unknown, there could be a glitch that shows up, and we're ready to accept that, then that actually keeps research fresh, right? And it keeps it quite inspiring in a way. And we are constantly open to accepting new things. But between encounter and conclusion, there is always a gap. And that gap is not filled by raw data alone. This is where I detect something like an intuitive phenomenology. Not simply psychological bias, not wishful thinking, but a form of instinctive pattern recognition. The mind, and perhaps something deeper than mind, moves to complete the picture. It draws connections. It senses coherence. It fills epistemological gaps so that meaning can stabilize. We already trust this process in everyday life. A seasoned organizer can walk into a room and read it. A historian can sense when an archive is hiding something. A scientist can feel when a model is elegant rather than forced. These are not irrational acts. They are disciplined intuitions shaped by immersion in reality. Mesotopian inquiry does not replace empiricism with vibes. It integrates empirical rigour with an honest account of the intuitive leap that always occurs at the edge of knowledge. So, empirical or intuitive? The answer is both. We live in a state of partial revelation. The world gives itself, but never entirely. Our task is to respond carefully, rigorously, and imaginatively. Not claim absolute certainty, but to make the most responsible best guess we can, and to remain open when the world answers back. As always, miath ka. And I think that's something I really want to hang on to, because this is not just me working in this area, by the way. This is very much a kind of what they might call a sort of postmodern idea of, well, how do we understand everything? You know, do we just retreat into skepticism about everything? Do we know nothing really, right? Can nothing, is everything up in the air again? And I would say, well, look, it's an ongoing process and we've got to be open to the fact that things can change. Okay, maybe we have laws and principles that are almost like sacrosanct now in academia, right? But there is always the possibility that we just discover something else and that becomes obsolete, and we have to be open to that and kind of embrace it. And I'm not suggesting that I know more than all of these empirical scientists. But what I found when I was going through the research methodologies of many other scientific materialists, oceanographers or zoologists, those kind of things, I was stunned by just how much guesswork was there, but not sort of in the foreground, And what I'm saying is, no. Okay, let's not just bury that. Let's just say, here are the facts, here's what we tested, here's what we know. Okay, and now in my conclusion, I'm going to sort of take a bit of a leap here. I'm going to speculate, or I'm going to intuit that actually this feels kind of right. And if we can just be a little bit more humble and embrace that, I think we're going to take a much more healthy attitude to research moving forward. We kind of know it instinctively. This is what I'm talking about. It's, in fact, the word instinct, isn't it? It's almost like it's in our body as somatic, what we might call a gut feeling. Now, there's sometimes that eludes evidence, but you kind of know in your heart when something isn't right or when something is right. And everything in your body is telling you that, regardless of actually what is in front of you. So we've all experienced this before, and I'm not sort of saying that we should shy away from that. I think there's quite a lot in there that needs to be unpacked. Anyway, I put a link to my thesis in the place below. I'm going off now to do some other things, got stuff to do, people to meet, places to go. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks very much for your time. Bye-bye.